until very recently. As recently as 1910 or so, Rudolf Otto, who was a great philosopher of religious experience, he defined God as the wholly and totally other. Well, to somebody raised on tabloid newspapers and 50s science fiction, the wholly, totally other sounds much more like invaders from the rim than anything associated with the Judeo-Christian tradition. Somehow, in the same way that we have Disneyfied the elves, we've actually Disneyfied God too. And so the old-fashioned phrase God-fearing, it has a very anachronistic ring. We modern people don't fear God. We deconstruct God. We may seek God as spiritual counselor and friend if we're, God positive people. If we're God negative people, we deny the very phenomenon. But if you spoke of being God-fearing, some people, I think, would think you must be Amish or Mennonite or something. It's such an old-fashioned emotion. The alien that comes through the psychedelic experience is terrifying in its alienness, in and of itself. It isn't that it does anything terrifying or that it promises a threat. It's simply that its existence inspires an awe which mutates into terror because it so turns on end all cultural values. In a way, you could almost say that culture is a defense against the sense of this thing, the wholly and totally other, which is there. And when culture fails, when culture has nothing more to say to you, such as when you're on your deathbed and, what's being sold down at the market no longer has any interest for you, and what's on TV seems irrelevant because you're going to die in the next hour. In other words, once you move beyond cultural values, then this terror, this awesome thing waits. It also attends birth, but only momentarily, because as soon as it's determined that you're alive, basically, as an infant being born, you're folded into the mechanisms of the waiting culture. So very rarely do we come nakedly against this thing which is there all the time. I maintain the reason it happens with a drug like DMT is because what drugs really do is dissolve this cultural illusion. They dissolve it so thoroughly that then this other thing which we've forgotten can rush in. I've noticed, I may be susceptible to this, but it does get described in the psychological dictionaries of pathology. But I'm susceptible, and I always have been, to, I suppose you would call it a form of hysteria, but it's fear in wilderness places. And if you have this, you know exactly what I mean. If you don't have it, it just seems like some kind of pathological weirdness. But it happens when you are alone in wilderness. In other words, when there is nobody there expressing cultural values. It's a recognized phenomenon of the human condition. There's an anthropology book about a tribe in Sumatra, the Tambunan. And the subtitle of the book is something like "The Felt Presence of the Other in the Extra-Community Context." And it talks about how, another name for it is Wendigo psychosis. The Wendigo, this is the more spectacular form. This is something that happens in the North Woods of Canada, where people who are out in these extreme wildernesses become convinced that they're being stalked by this animal, which is a supernatural animal, the Wendigo. And the Indians know this thing, and they fear it. It's sort of like the Sachamama idea in the Amazon. It's an enormous beast that is more feared by the people than anything making it onto the Discovery Channel. You know, they can handle anacondas, they can handle jaguars, but the Wendigo and the Sachamama are beyond, you know, the hunter's skill, the shaman's power. It's something overwhelming. And I think that part of the consequences of scientific materialism and existentialism is to place us into an extracultural environment, and then we are afraid of, you know, something strange that comes from the sky that is so intimately hostile that it, you know, wants to look up our rear ends and trade our fetal tissue and you know, mess with us in ways which aren't rational if it's a, you know, a true species come from another star system. I don't think they'd start the contact with the human race by checking us all for hemorrhoids. That doesn't feel right. So it's something else then. It's something else, and it is a template of our fears of being penetrated in a perverse manner. That's basically what's going on there. Our fears of having our genetic material tampered with. That's what the fetal tissue trading is all about. Our fears of having our humanness compromised, I think. I mean, it is, in a sense, a true boogeyman. It's pure, unadulterated fear. The aliens of popular culture, the Greys, the slant-eyed, all this zoo of things that haunt the tabloids, are very different from the DMT creatures, who are much more similar to the Earth-centered supernatural beings like fairies, elves, gnomes, nixies, sprites, afrits, jinns, tree spirits, who all have a morbid quality. I mean, they all enchant in some way and lead astray, but it's not a planetary invasion, and it doesn't have these sexual overtones of sexual anxiety that seem to attend this other thing. Bottom line, I think, it's a wonderful... Being alive is a very interesting situation, but only if you pay attention. You know, otherwise it tends to drift into the background, and something else takes its place. Our circumstance is extraordinary. Even measured against the existence of animal life on this planet, our situation is extraordinary. And a mind is a very dynamically chaotic, undefined thing. Still more, you know, the group mind of a species. The nature of information is not understood. The nature of this thing coordinating all this information, which we call the human soul, is not very well understood. One of the fallacies that haunts clear thinking is the fallacy of the mundane. There really is no mundane. I mean, when you start deconstructing things, everything it turns out mystery stands behind the simplest phenomena, the simplest act. Its casuistry reaches back eons of time. Its implications spread out through the universe. And, who is witness to all of this? Simply the unaided human mind trying to struggle forward toward a model of itself and a model of the world that it's embedded in. And culture, even the culture of science or the culture of mathematics, where it pretends to build firm ground, there is in fact really only quicksand, or at the very best the kind of bridges that occur in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and the Knights of the Round Table, the kind of bridge that you can ride a horse across before the bridge burns and tumbles into the abyss, but that's all you can move across it. I mean, we're constantly living like that, Think how many of us are dead. Almost all of us are dead at any given time. I don't mean this in a Gurdjieffian or metaphorical sense. I mean that 99.99% of all human beings who ever lived are now dead. The living portion of mankind is a thin sliver compared to all who have come and gone over the past 3 or 4 million years. And so the enterprise of understanding, which seems to rest with the living, inherits a huge momentum from these people who've gone before. I mean, the dynamic tension or the interest in life, at least for me, is in trying to be a human being to whatever degree that's possible, and then in also trying to understand it all from the outside, trying to be, both fully human and somehow fully extra environmental, extra human. My mother, for God knows what reasons, because it didn't particularly lie in her background or education, named me after a Roman poet. And this Roman poet was a fairly minor character, and he wrote these sort of foppish little social comedies, these plays. But one quote survives from the Roman poet Terence. He said, I am a human being, and therefore nothing human is alien to me. And the dilemma of our moment in modernity, I think, in terms of these whisperings from the other, is to decide that nothing human is alien to us, and that all aliens have one foot in humanness. Well, why don't we knock off there? That's good enough. Thank you. A meandering diatribe, but hey. Waiting for other people to show up, and just because I couldn't resist, I've been wanting to talk about this book, and I decided I'd talk about it just a little bit. This book is called On the Edge. It's a novel. It's not available in this country, but you can order it from Amazon.com because it's an English novel. It's by a guy named Edward St. Aubin, Teddy to his friends. And some of you may remember Teddy. He was here about 5 years ago, very quietly doing research. And this is the product of that research. This is a novel about the world we're sitting in this evening. And I thought I would read just a little tiny bit of this because it amused me, not for any other reason. I don't know how many times I've eaten in the Esalen dining room. I don't know how many times many of you have eaten there. And it's always a psychological environment fraught with various possibilities. He's seen this girl earlier in the tubs. Peter didn't have long to wait to see Crystal again. He found her a couple of hours after they had met in the tubs, queuing up for dinner in the lodge. Her short t-shirt left her belly exposed, and he saw the navel ring again, the skin a little inflamed where the ring pierced the lower edge of her navel. "Hi, Crystal," he said, picking up a plate and following her down the line of salads. "You're staring at my ring," she said. Yes, I'm afraid I was," he said, transferring his gaze to the sliced cucumbers. "Don't be afraid, at least not of that," she laughed. "When they put this ring in, I had an orgasm right there in the shop. It was wild. The guy said, 'This is definitely your energy center.'" Peter was silenced by this information, but recovered in time to say, "Does it still have that effect on you?" "Sure, that's why it's there." Gosh, thought Peter, these California girls are amazing. He felt his own Englishness and stiffness and inability to decipher Crystal's candor. If an English woman told you about an orgasm the second time you chatted together, you knew that she either wanted sex straight away or that she'd been educated at a convent. Over here, one had no idea what it meant. Peter wanted to ask Crystal to sit with him, but in the communal dining room he felt the usual sense of personal and social meltdown known locally as lodge psychosis. Instead of the sense of community it was designed to promote, the lodge shipwrecked its occupants by presenting them with a series of treacherous whirlpools and rocky dilemmas. Acquaintances imagined they were friends. Friends turned into strangers. Seminarians were looked down on by residents, and residents exploited by staff. Teachers appeared to be available to students, but were suddenly ringed by jealous lovers and competitive sidekicks. Anyone at any time could come and process an issue with you, however turgid or trivial, whether you could remember meeting them before or not. The person to whom you told the secret of your mother's mental illness the night before might not remember your name by lunchtime the next day. The permissiveness that made sex seem pleasingly inevitable made you realize more sharply the internal constraints that prevented you from approaching the objects of desire. But the same permissiveness could not stop the bore you most dreaded from bearing down on you with greedy tactlessness when you were deeply engaged with someone else. Like the place as a whole, the lodge made a partial transcendence of the formalities and hypocrisies of ordinary social life, but at the same time generated the longing for the good manners and the privacy which these formalities, until they became corrupted, were designed to protect. Psychologically bleeding and half drowned, but still hoping to preserve an air of purpose and self-possession, Peter had often wandered back and forth in the last 3 days, plate in hand, meeting or avoiding glances he was no longer calm enough to interpret accurately, or being dragged with a fixed smile on his face to a table of people he had no reason to spend time with. "Shall we sit together?" he murmured almost inaudibly. "Sure." And then this I particularly liked. It isn't this room, but it's a room within 150 feet of us that way. And we've all been there, or I assume most of us have been there. In the dimness of the large white room, 30 seminarians formed a rough circle. Sleepy after dinner and relaxed by the introductory nature of the meeting, they slouched, stretched, or leaned on huge cushions. Some sat in a half-lotus position. Others rested their chins on their clutched knees. Occupying the noonday point on this human clock, Martha Goldenstein and her assistant were languaging up the aims of their workshop. Outside, the sea let go and moved on with a fluency which even Martha must have regarded as an unobtainable ideal. This is a workshop called Letting Go and Moving On. and who Martha Goldenstein is. And there are lots, if you're an Esselenite, you'll recognize lots of people in here. And with all, is it pronounced Romana Cleff? Romana Cleff? Romana Cleff? A novel which thinly disguises personalities easily recognized to insiders. This is full of them. Who knows? Some of you might be in here. Anyway, On the Edge by Eddie St. Aubin. I think he'll be invited back. Nancy was vaguely amused. Of course, what Bobo will think, I'm not sure, but everybody has to take their knocks in this world.